All right, we've been in Isaiah for several weeks. We're not taking this a verse-by-verse study for the simple reason we would never finish it if we did a verse-by-verse study of Isaiah, because it's a long book. But we are ready to move on this morning. But let's review what we talked about last time. We're in chapter 7, if you're wanting to find a particular place. Talking about Isaiah's discussion about what scholars call the Syro-Ephraimitic War. In verses 1 and 2, and we gave a history lesson last week about Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria. He came to power, and his one driving force was to conquer the world. And he set out to do that almost immediately. And of course, that's intertwined within the biblical narrative, because he's the one who's going to be taking the 10 northern tribes away into permanent captivity. And that is happening. Isaiah is prophesying, and that's going to happen during his prophecy time. And of course, his prophecy is mainly towards Judah. And so we know that that's there, but that specter of what's happening in Assyria is affecting Judah because they're right there on the border. Pekah of Israel and Rezin of Syria formed a coalition to resist Assyria. And they asked Ahaz to join, who was the king of Judah. And Ahaz said no, he wasn't going to do that. You recall, he refuses to join the battle. They attacked him, and it was quite hard for him. 120,000 Judeans were killed and another 200,000 taken captive. The biblical narrative gives us that description. Philistines also raided Judah's southern border. And then the Edomites captured Elath. And so while Israel is the focus of God's wrath at this point in time, and he's bringing close to those rebellious people, Judah is suffering as a result of that. The people are trying to get them, trying to destroy them. The only thing that staves that off is Hoshea murders Pekah and begins paying heavy tribute to Assyria. And that kind of stops the ire of Tiglath-Pileser III for a little while. And while he did that, in 732, Assyria ravages Damascus, which is at that point in time was not a part of Israel. And then Ahaz, in order to avoid Assyria involvement, pays heavy tribute to Assyria to spare the country. Then in 722 BC, Israel is taken away by Assyria, and that's the end of them, and the end of that northern kingdom that broke away after Solomon died. Isaiah sees Ahaz's action as a lack of faith in God. And he has a problem with what Ahaz is doing. And we're going to talk more about that and the fallout from that, the, shall we say, unintended consequences that Ahaz that probably wasn't thinking about, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Then we did a brief discussion of the word virgin in verse 14 of chapter 7. It's that messianic prophecy, virgin shall bring forth a son, and you shall call his name what? Emmanuel, which means God with us. And of course, a direct prophecy of Jesus Christ. Matthew repeats that prophecy almost verbatim, and uses that in reference to Jesus. And so that's what we talked about last week. That's a summary of everything we talked about last week. And this week we'll start, talked about unintended consequences. And this really has nothing to do per se with Isaiah, but it's kind of interesting to think about. I don't think this is something you'd get up, or Grady or I would get up and preach on a Sunday morning, but it's interesting to think about it this way. And this is from J. Alec Moyer in the Prophecy of Isaiah, an introduction and commentary. And here's what he says. From the time of Ahaz, there never was again a house of David in the true sense. And hang on to that, because we'll talk about what that means. But only a line of puppet pretend kings under alien domination, until at the exile, even they disappeared into the sands of history, never to reemerge. The name of the overlord power would change from Assyria to Babylon to Persia to Greece and finally to Rome before Emmanuel would be born. But when he was born, it was to share the poverty of his people, to inherit a non-existent throne, and to feel the full weight of the oppressor. The blame for all this rested on Ahaz and his failure to believe in the Lord's word. The promise awaited its time, but the threat was immediate. And I kind of find that interesting because, again, actions have consequences. And we don't always know what those consequences are going to be. And again, the fact that Isaiah was unhappy with Ahaz tells us something about Ahaz's decision. And you remember last week, we talked about Ahaz. Ahaz was challenged by Isaiah. Ask God for anything. You make it hard. You make it outlandish. You make it stupendous. You ask him for anything and see if he'll do it. And what did Ahaz say? Nope, not going to do it. And he said, I won't test God that way. And we talked about, well, that sounds like kind of a righteous answer, doesn't it? Sounds like he's got his heart in the right place. But obviously that's not the case. He said, I'm not going to test God that way. That's his way of saying, this is not about God. This is about who? Me, Ahaz. And so, we talked about that last week. And so, it's interesting to think about, there were a few more kings of Israel who sat on the throne, but were there any of them that had absolute authority over Israel? No. They were all puppet kings of Syria, of Babylon, of whatever. And then there were probably no kings at all, just the overlords that happened to be in charge of them at that moment. Howard Brandt said, I think the decisive clue comes from Matthew's chronology. I can't read this morning. Of Jesus Christ, and that's Matthew 1, verses 1 through 16. Here is the listing of the line of Abraham to Christ through David. If you follow the list, you will see that all those after David who ruled down to the captivity were well-known kings of Judah. When they went into captivity, Jeconiah, Jehoiachin as he was called, was the legitimate king. He bore Shealtiel, who was the father of Zerubbabel, chapter 1 and verse 12. And Zerubbabel was the ruler of Judah upon their return from captivity. I think as you piece this together, you have to conclude that Zerubbabel would have been a king if kings were still ruling, which they were not. Zerubbabel was called governor, likely because Cyrus, king of Persia, was the ruler of the world, and he did not allow other kings to be in part of his world domination. And so it's again interesting. Back to that comment. That's the situation Jesus came into. There wasn't a throne for him to sit on. That wasn't the intent, that he wasn't going to sit on a physical earthly throne. That wasn't what God was going to do. But in that line of successors of kings, the scepter will not depart from the house of David. That was a promise given to him. And Jesus would come. Are you the king of Israel? He would ask. And how did he respond? It is as you say. He acknowledged he was the king of Israel. But not in the sense of sitting on a throne, taking in taxation, ruling the world in that sense. His kingdom was a spiritual kingdom. And he said that. If my kingdom was of this world, my followers would do what? They'd fight. We'd have our swords out and we'd be after you. But it wasn't. It was a spiritual kingdom. And so it's, again, that's, however you want to look at that, is kind of an interesting thing to think about, to ponder and contemplate how that plan worked out in the sense. But there wasn't a successive line of powerful kings that ruled over Israel. And all of that was because, why? They disobeyed God. They kept disobeying God, and they kept disobeying God. He sent them Jeremiah, he sent them Hosea, he sent them all the prophets. And the prophets spent their times preaching, come back to God, do his will, and they refused. And that was the end result of that even their kingship. And remember, and again, this is ironic, way back in the day, days of Samuel, Israel said, we want a king. How did Samuel respond to that? He was livid, wasn't he? He knew that was a slap in the face of God because he knew that God was king. And God came to Samuel and calmed him down and said, it's okay. It's not you they've rejected, it's me. And that's okay because this will work out. I'll make sure that it works out. And so they got a king. And they had Saul, who turned out to be, well, not so good. And then they had David, a powerful king. Not a perfect man. We just finished Vacation Bible School on our 4 Wednesday night in June, and we talked about David's life. He was an imperfect man, but yet his heart was for God. And that was kind of the theme of Vacation Bible School. And he had a heart for God, he just couldn't always do the right thing. And so David was a kid. Then we had Solomon. And Solomon brought Israel on the world stage in a way they had never been and never would ever be again, of power and wealth and prestige and honor and glory. And yet Solomon himself, what happened to him? His wives and his concubines turned his heart away toward the end of his life. And so that imperfect obedience to God, and not that we can do perfect obedience, that's impossible, but a lot of this disobedience was not just they couldn't do it, it was willful disobedience. When God says, you shall have no other gods before me, and there's a shrine to Baal on every hill, that's willful, isn't it? That's obviously they're not going to do what God asked them to do. And so it changed the whole tone and timbre of what God set up under Samuel with the kings. And all of that would, for how many hundreds of years, would continue on until we get down to Isaiah's day, where we're about to fall into that Babylonian captivity. And again, it was all because they disobeyed God. Then in chapter 7, beginning in verse 8, first of all, any thoughts, comments on that before we go any further? Again, like I said, just a side note, something I found interesting, and if I thought it was interesting, I figured you might think it was interesting. And if you do, great, and if you didn't, well, sorry for taking up your time. The punishment of unbelievers, chapter 7, verses 18 through 25. In that day, and again, this is continuing on from what we talked about last week with all that's going on between Rezin and Pekah and Tiglath-Pileser III and the fall of Israel. In that day, again, talking about those many years ago, the Lord will whistle and remind you. I'm using the New Living Translation through this study. A couple of you have a couple of times said, what version are you using? We normally use the New King James Version here or English Standard, whatever, but I like the way, in most cases, the New Living Translation kind of updates and modernizes the language and the syntax for us. So that's why I'm using it. And so if it reads different from your Bible, that's why. In that day the Lord will whistle. And he's already said that once in Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 26. Now, what does whistle mean? What in this context? It's a call, isn't it? John?
The Old King James has hiss.
Hiss. Okay. So it's a hiss. It's a call. In that day the Lord will call for the army of southern Egypt and for the army of Assyria. They will swarm around you like flies and bees. They will come in vast hordes and settle in the fertile areas and in the desolate valley, caves, and thorny places. In that day the Lord will hire a razor from beyond the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria, and use it to shave off everything, your land, your crops, your people. In that day a farmer will be fortunate to have a cow and 2 sheep or goats left. Nevertheless, there will be enough milk for everyone because so few people will be left in the land. They will eat their fill of yogurt and honey. In that day, the lush vineyards, now worth 1,000 pieces of silver, will become patches of briars and thorns. The entire land will become a vast expanse of briars and thorns, a hunting ground overrun by wildlife. No one will go to the fertile hillsides where the gardens once grew, for briars and thorns will cover them. Cattle, sheep, and goats will graze there. So again, the depressing picture that Isaiah is presenting to the people of Judah. Armies of Egypt, the armies of Assyria, they'll be like flies and bees, and they will literally ravage the landscape. They will destroy everything. And the few of you who are left, yeah, there's a wandering cow, there's a few goats out there, you'll probably be able to survive, only because there's not enough of you to eat everything those few animals can provide. That's how dire the consequences were going to be for what was going to happen there. Have 1,000 pieces of silver vineyard. Don't know how much that's worth in modern money, but it sounds expensive to me. Sounds like you see going through various wine countries and those huge vineyards and buildings and all of that, and it's very elaborate. And I kind of get that picture when I think about what the vineyards were like when they were following God and what they were like then once they were destroyed. And again, kind of a side note here, when Israel crossed over the Jordan under the leadership of Joshua, God made certain promises to them. What were some of those promises about what they were going to find in that land? Milk and honey. Rick?
Houses they did not build.
Houses they didn't build. Wells they didn't dig. Vineyards they didn't plant. They're going to move into a set-up society. A set-up, infrastructure. That's a big word in politics today. They had the infrastructure and everything they needed to survive and to thrive. And he said, I'll give you rain when you need it. I'll give you sun when you need it. And he even specifically says, notice back down there in verse 24, hunting ground overrun by wildlife. And it doesn't specifically say there, but I'll even protect you from the wild animals. We living in Colorado, how many of you had a bear at your house? We got a few of you, especially those who live west and up. Mike's had one out at his place. And bobcats, mountain lions, all of those things, wild animals. We live in that, what is the proper term now, interface, wildlife, wildland interface. And so we run into wild animals. God said, you don't have to worry about that. You can leave your trash cans out at night and the bears won't get in them, is basically what he was saying. And all of that was promised to Israel with the caveat of what? If you remain faithful. And so it's interesting to me that land promise, which started forever ago with Abraham. Look around you, I'll give you all of this land. And he eventually did under the days of Joshua. And that land promise is so directly tied to God's presence with Israel that here Isaiah is pointing out to them, which they should be thinking about, your land's about to be laid bare. It's about to be laid waste because of your disobedience. Flo? Flo makes a good comment. You think with that dire prediction, they would think, ooh, wait, maybe we ought to do something different. And they didn't. They didn't. They continued in their evil ways, and again, we all know the end result of that. And so that land promise is important and significant to Israel, and yet even that seems to be not enough for them to remain faithful to God. And I scratch my head, and you scratch your head and say, couldn't they see? Couldn't they understand? Couldn't they know that? And the answer is, well, yeah, they could, but why didn't they respond? What do you think? What's the answer to that question? Why didn't they respond appropriately? What's that?
Habits are hard to break.
Habits are hard to break. You've done that for 3, 4, 5, 6 generations, and the 6th generation probably doesn't even remember anything about that generation before. Janelle? Okay. Janelle says it really wasn't what they wanted. They looked around, the Baals, the Asherah, all the things that the other nations around them were doing, and they said, hey, that's pretty cool. That's pretty neat. Let's do that. And they did. Yeah, never satisfied, Flo says. Manna from heaven, they got tired of that. If they eat another piece of manna, I think I'm going to die. And it was an issue for them. Elwin, you got a comment?
Yeah, it makes you think about what happened to people that were faithful. If you go back to the book of Daniel, there's a really good description of the faith that some of the people still believed in God and depended on Him to take care of them, even when they were in bondage. So, you consider the fact that it's just like we know today, those of us that are Christians, we have to put up with the evils and everything in the world. Most of the people are part of that destruction. So here we are, very less numbered and given power and everything other than what God gives us. So the laws, the things that happen to us, this, that, and the other, we're just passing through. And I believe that they believe the promises of God, that they would be restored. So therefore, we were both in the same situation that they were back then.
Elwin talking about what Isaiah would call the remnant, the branch, those who remain faithful, because there still were people faithful in Israel at that point in time. We know that because when in the Babylonian captivity, you had people like David and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, or their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who were faithful. There were still faithful people in there, but their numbers were very small. And again, how frustrating was that? How frustrating must it have been for Isaiah, for Jeremiah, to be prophesying during that time, trying to be faithful and knowing that the people just really didn't care. And you and I can find ourselves, I think many of us would say, maybe the world's a lot like that right now. We can't, it seems like everything that we as Christians want to do, the world says, nah. And basically at this point they say, just go back to your church buildings and do your thing and leave us alone. And sometimes we do that to the detriment of the world. Marcia?
Well, because they're human just like we are. They just think that, we can take care of ourselves. We don't have to worry about it.
So in other words, you're saying they were like Ahaz. I'll do it my way. And that's what the world seems to be thinking that they're doing rather than God's way. Can we be guilty of that? Okay, we are guilty of that. How about in the church? Yeah. I mean, we can do that. And it's, again, so-called preaching to the choir this morning because you're here for Bible class, but at the same time, we can do that. We can become so wrapped up in our own lives and in the things we want to do and everything that becomes more important perhaps than God. And what is anything that's more important than God? An idol, idolatry, which is exactly what was going on in the book of Isaiah that we're reading. So it's, again, the lessons here, all the history lesson and all the things that happened back there, that's interesting, and it's important for us to understand what happened, and Bible trivia history lesson is a good thing to know all that stuff. But the message is, don't do that. Don't do the same thing they did. And so the message for us isn't so much about the value of a vineyard or the wildlife or the goats or any of that. What the message is, well, as Jesus said, if you love me, do what? Keep my commandments. That's the message of Isaiah for us, boiled down to its basic component. And really, you want to boil down the Bible to its basic component, what is it? Obey God. Do what He says. That's simple as that. And whatever I want to do, whatever my pride and arrogance suggests that I should do, whatever my lofty goals and aspirations should be, those all ought to follow under the umbrella of what God's will is in my life. And if Israel had done that, just think about this. If Israel had lived faithful to God, there wouldn't have been a Babylonian captivity. There wouldn't have been an Assyrian captivity. None of that would have happened. But history's what it is. We can't change that. Glenn, go ahead.
That description that you had of all of the things that were taking place, the Assyrians were very some of the things they did were almost unbelievable that they would do to people. They were very cruel people.
Yeah, one of the trademarks of the Assyrians is their utter cruelty, and they were just evil people. That's all you can say about them. And they didn't care what they did to their people. They wanted world domination. They were going to do it their way. And if you got in the way, you'd lose your head. Basically, is what would happen in that context. Chapter 8. The Lord said to me, "Make a large sign and clearly write this name on it: Meher Shalal Hashbaz." It's another name I practiced all week. Where's Grady? He's been waiting. He said, "I can't wait till you get there and pronounce that." So I've been practicing it all week to get it out here. I'm not saying it again. I've said it once. I asked Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of now I can't even pronounce that. I didn't practice this one. Jeberechiah, both known as honest men, to witness my doing this. Then I slept with my wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, "Call him that name, for before this child is old enough to say Papa or Mama, the king of Assyria will carry away both the abundance of Damascus and Damascus and the riches of Samaria. And so, again, as Isaiah does, the book isn't just chronologically that. We had the first 5 chapters before we ever got to the 6th chapter, which was the call of Isaiah. And so now then we're back to Isaiah's family, and Isaiah's family is very deliberately used as part of the message. And so this kid's name is Swift to Plunder, Quick to Carry Away, is his name, which is exactly what in the previous verses he said Assyria was going to do. So all that's tying together. That's from the Brown Driver Biggs Hebrew and English lexicon. And so it's interesting there. Make a sign. Put the sign of the name on there. And his name, his birth is going to be a sign of what I just told you is going to happen. He said, I asked Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah, maybe that's close, both known as honest men, to witness my doing this. And so, why did he call on these 2 people to witness what he said? Okay, honesty. The facts of the case must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, Deuteronomy 19 and verse 15, and that's repeated in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 28. 2 or 3 witnesses. And so God is going through the motions of following his own law. Here's what's going to happen. Uriah and Zechariah are going to be witnesses of that. Therefore, it confirms by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so, God's saying, I want you to get this. I want you to understand this. This is my will. This is what's coming. And then, before this child is old enough to say Papa or Mama, the king of Assyria will carry away both the abundance of Damascus and the riches of Samaria. There's going to be a child born. Before he's old enough to say Papa or Mama, what's going to happen? Those things I just told you about are going to happen. And so God, he gave them definitive explanation of what was going to happen. This is going to happen. He gave a definitive answer of when it's going to happen. And then he gave them a sign to confirm when it was going to happen. And so again, and then we just read about earlier that they came in, and Assyria came in and ravaged Damascus. So here's God telling them exactly what's going to happen. It happens exactly the way it happens, and Israel says what? Yeah, no thanks. We'll just continue doing the same thing we've been doing. And again, that's obviously part of the problem. Then the Lord spoke to me again and said, my care for my people of Judah is like the gently flowing waters of Shiloh. But they have rejected it. They are rejoicing over what will happen to King Rezin and King Pekah. Therefore the Lord will overwhelm them with a mighty flood from the Euphrates River. The king of Assyria in all his glory, this flood will overflow its channels. And so he starts there with an interesting statement. My care for the people is like the gently flowing waters of Shiloh. What do you think when you're beside a gently flowing river or a gently flowing stream or a babbling brook? Peace. Peace, tranquility. You can sit out there and listen and watch the birds and all of that. You know, we went over to Ouray a few weeks ago with our oldest kids and spent a week over there, or not a week, a few days over there, going through the canyon over there toward Glenwood Springs. The Colorado in snowmelt was not the gently flowing waters of Shiloh. It was just roiling and splashing up, and you know, it's one of those, it was so bad you wouldn't even really want to stand on the trail beside it because you'd be afraid you'd get sucked in. And yet, we were up in the mountains, and some of the places there were these gently flowing creeks, and just amazingly peaceful and nice and wonderful. And yet, the picture is there's a flood coming. And it's coming from Assyria. It's coming from the Euphrates River. Again, continuing the message on, he's already said. He's not saying anything new. He's just using different word pictures to describe it. The king of Assyria and all his glory. It's not like this was a surprise. The king of Assyria and all his glory, this will overflow all of its channels. Sweep into Judah until it's chin deep. It will spread its wings, submerging your land from one end to the other. O Emmanuel, huddle together, you nations, and be terrified. Listen, all you distant lands, prepare for battle, but you'll be crushed. Listen, all you distant lands, prepare for battle, but you will be crushed. Yes, prepare for battle, but you will be crushed. Call your councils of war, but they will be worthless. Develop your strategies, and they will not succeed, for God is with us, Emmanuel. Kind of interesting wording there. For right now, he's talking to Judah, and he's saying, right now it's a gently flowing stream, but something's coming. And for the rest of the nations, for the 10 northern tribes, for all of those people that have completely and totally disrespected God, there is a flood coming that's going to wash them away, and they will be gone. But for now, God is with us. God is with us. We're safe. Message ought to be, okay, maybe we ought to get back to doing what God asked us to do. What was it? Well, you know the answer to that. The Lord has given me a strong warning not to think like everyone else does, he says. I don't call everything a conspiracy like they do, and don't live in dread of what frightens them. Make the Lord of heaven's armies holy in your life. He is the one you should fear. He is the one who should make you tremble. He will keep you safe. New King James words that he will be your sanctuary. But to Israel and Judah, he will be a stone that makes people stumble, a rock that makes them fall. And for all the people of Jerusalem, he will be a trap and snare. Many will stumble and fall, never to rise again, and they will be snared and captured. The immediate fulfillment of that prophecy was in Isaiah's day. What was the ultimate fulfillment of that prophecy? Jesus, who became what? The stumbling stone, a rock of offense, a trap and a snare for Jerusalem. And again, those prophecies of Isaiah, speaking of which, Rick asked last week if we might have a copy of during our introductory material. We just had a few select prophecies in Isaiah and their place of fulfillment in the New Testament. If you'd like to have a copy of that, they're laying down here on the front row. Please take all you want. If you need more, let me know and I'll print out more. All right, we're out of time. Appreciate you being here this morning. Thank you.